All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Howard Feldman, and I want to do something a little bit different, not as different perhaps as drumming, but I want to talk to you about dealing with the fear of innovation. What is a fear of innovation? Why are you going to come across customers and people in the workplace who have some difficulty with embracing something new? And we're going to look at what happens if you don't. What are the examples, and what are we going to be facing if we don't deal with some of these issues in the workplace? Now, it's a bit obscure, but there's a bunch of things I want you to look at: man flu, a lost watch, spring, electrically shocked dogs, Kodak, the spice trade, and a 1/4-inch drill bit. There's no chance you're going to be able to tell me right now what they have in common. But by the end of this, what I want to do is create just a little bit of a thread, and using these things, perhaps you'll be able to come to some form of conclusion. So bear with me. It might be a little bit different and a little bit obscure, and this pole is obscuring, so I can't see everybody, but all right, I'm going to try and move around a little bit so that we can. And so let's go through what some of these things are. So the first thing that we want to look at is what do they have in common, and what do they have to do with a fear of innovation? Okay, are people afraid of innovation? Is innovation the thing that we're actually afraid of, or are we very, very simply just afraid? You know, are we nervous about things? Are we nervous about change? What is it that we fear when it comes to technology and everything else? And I want to start off with a story. It's actually been attributed to Sigmund Freud, and of course we all know that name, and we all know that name because everybody loves to hate and challenge Sigmund Freud, which means he must have done something right. Otherwise we wouldn't be still talking about him so much later. But there's a story that Sigmund Freud tells, and I think to me it's one of the most powerful stories. He speaks about a guy that comes across his friend. It's a dark night in Vienna, and he comes across his friend who's looking for something underneath a street lamp. And he's looking, and his friend says to him, "What have you lost?" And he says, "I've lost my pocket watch." And he says, "Well, let me help you find it." And they're looking, and eventually he says to him, "Where did you actually lose it?" And he says, "No, over there in that dark alley." So he says, "But why are you looking here?" He says, "Because it's lighter here." And it sounds funny, but I wonder if that isn't a theme that we sometimes maybe do ourselves. Maybe we look for the answers, and maybe we look for things in completely the wrong place, because maybe we're scared of the dark. And obviously, I know it's late, and I know you technology people, but you do know that I'm being figurative, right? Okay. I always get nervous when I talk to technology people because you're not afraid of technology. But sometimes there's just like a little bit of a thing that you take things a bit differently to others. Okay, so maybe we are afraid. Maybe we're all a little bit afraid of the dark. Maybe we've always looked where it's light, so we don't like to change. This is where we've always looked. Maybe we're scared of what we're going to find, and maybe we're scared of what somebody would say if they see us in that dark alley looking for something. Or maybe it's just so much easier for us to be in the light, because dark's not pleasant, right? It's just not a pleasant place to be. When I work with companies, the very first question that I often ask people is, if you're running a hardware store, and somebody comes into your hardware store and says they need a 1/4-inch drill bit, what is it that they are looking for? What are they looking for is a way to drill a 1/4-inch hole. And most companies that I talk to, and most people that I work with, the first thing I'll say, "What are you trying to sell them?" And they'll say, "Sell them the drill bit, but then sell them a new drill, and sell them the whole set, and sell them a toolbox." And at no time does anybody say, "Well, hold on, let's look at what the problem is that they're trying to solve." So that's our first thing that we have to look at. And I know that I'm jumping all over the show with these stories, but it's all going to come together in the end. So I want you to remember this issue and remember what I'm talking about when I say that if a customer is looking for a 1/4-inch drill bit, what he actually needs is a 1/4-inch hole. And that's important. And I want to stop completely on those bizarre little stories, and I want to talk to you about the ice trade. And I don't know if any of you have followed the Singularity University, David Roberts. He speaks about this, and I found the story absolutely fascinating. So it all started when people were looking for a way to preserve meat. It was before refrigeration. It was before people used ice. So what did they do? What did they use? Spice. Because they thought incorrectly that spice preserved meat. It didn't. It just masked the taste of rotten meat, but that's something completely different. So this whole world develops around the exploration for spice. And continents are discovered, empires are built, and empires are lost. It's the most phenomenal thing, because spice, effectively, actually, you guys would understand this, is the Bitcoin of today. It became this entire industry. But whilst this is happening, a very, very strange guy, and he really was a bit of a strange guy, by the name of Frederick Tudor, comes along. Now, he's a complete lunatic. He's a maverick. He understands there's another way to preserve meat, and that is with ice. What's his history? He lives in Boston, where there's these incredible lakes that are frozen over, and he starts to see that if you chip out big blocks of ice and deliver them to your customers around Boston area and wherever else they might be, then they can preserve meat. So he thinks it's a fantastic idea, and what does he do? He starts experimenting with trying to find ways that he could take this ice further and further around the world. And initially, it's a complete disaster, because he lands up in debtor's jail. That's what they did in those days. If you couldn't pay your debt, off to jail. Thankfully, they don't do that today anymore. But it's a complete disaster. It's a complete disaster for him. And he lands up in jail. He comes out of jail, but he is driven. He knows that this is an industry. So he starts again, and slowly he starts finding ways. He begins to find ways that he could move ice further and further away from Boston. He finds these ships and he packs it with sawdust and hay. He experiments, and eventually he manages to get his ice all the way to India, and that's the goal, of course. But at that time, people didn't use ice for drinks, so he had to now come up with a marketing plan. So he delivered them to places that sold drinks, and he gave ice for free, and then people started to love it, and so it became a massive, massive business. While this happens, of course, what happens to the spice trade? It dies, because you don't need spice to preserve meat. You've got ice. So that's the end of the spice trade. Here he is developing this whole ice trade, and he starts to become very, very successful, and ultimately becomes the king of ice. He ships to India. They become dependent on ice. He starts now opening warehouses all over the world. He's got his own fleet of vessels. He's really built an ice empire. But while this is happening, something else is happening in the background. And what is that? Refrigeration, of course. Very simply, electricity. So he's not looking. He's not noticing what is happening, because he's focused on growing his business. Like the spice people were focused on growing on keeping their business alive. And ultimately what happens is the whole ice industry collapses. Now, the incredible thing about the story, there are a few incredible things, but each and every one of these industries had vessels, they had warehouses. For the spice trade to convert to the ice trade was simply a matter of focus. They had everything. For the ice trade to shift to refrigeration with electricity was nothing. He needed to electrify his warehouses because storage was always important, it still is important, and he needed to fix his vessels, but he doesn't do that. So the whole way through, not one industry transitions. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, the interesting thing as well is I will bet you, maybe this group is a bit different, but most people I talk to will say, I'll say, well, and now, where do we go from here? And everyone says, well, nowhere, because we've got refrigeration. But the reality is we also have long life milk today. And we've got meat that lasts longer, and we've got fruit that lasts longer. And in San Francisco, they've worked out that with only 2 drone stations, they can deliver product to you within 5 minutes. So therefore, maybe in 10 or 15 years' time, we're not going to even need refrigeration. But we automatically assume that because this is where we are at, this is the end of the road. For the spice people, that was true in their minds. So that is something worth, and in fact, it was interesting. I spoke about an article on my show this morning that Uber Eats are looking to hire people in San Francisco to design a drone delivery system. Look, I think they've got to get the car delivery system right for Uber Eats, but that's something completely different. But very interesting that we are already starting to see the world, not South Africa, because can you imagine, like, you know, a drone delivering your food, there's no chance it's going to be there by the time it gets to you. But that's something completely different. So, all right, excuse the cynicism, it's late in the afternoon. So what I find interesting on this is go back now to our 1/4-inch drill. What the companies were looking at here is they focused on their own business. They didn't focus on what their customers were starting to need. In other words, go back to my other story, they were looking under the street lamp. They were not looking in the dark for solutions. And these are very, very important distinguishing factors. So what went wrong? They looked where it was light, and they didn't ask what their customer was looking for. All right, can you give me some examples of other companies? Let's go right through to companies that we can relate to. Any ideas? Sorry, exactly. Okay, so the great examples of companies that didn't evolve are these companies. Kodak, BlackBerry, Xerox. I nearly didn't even recognize that Nokia over there. But those are companies, many companies who haven't evolved. And let's take a look just at Kodak, because I think that to me is one of the most interesting and obvious examples of companies that didn't evolve. Now, what is so tragic about Kodak? Okay, first of all, who were Kodak? Kodak were the bastions of our memory. They were the vaults of our memories in the 20th century. They recorded everything for us. They were the film. They stored film. They stored pictures. But they did it with chemicals on paper and on film. So that's who Kodak was. But I didn't realize this until I started researching it, that Kodak actually invented the digital camera. I don't know how many people knew that. I didn't know that. Did anybody know? Okay, one person, a few people maybe knew. I certainly didn't know that. I was shocked because I assumed that Kodak were blindsided by the whole digital industry. It turns out, in fact, that they weren't. That Steve Sasson, who was the Kodak engineer, he invents a digital camera in 1975. He goes to management and says, look what I've produced. And they say, yeah, it's a very nice thing that you've done, well done, but let's just keep it between us. Now, that's crazy, because if they were doing it, it was obvious that somebody else was going to do it. Why? Because what did their customer want? The customer didn't want a piece of paper or a film. They didn't care. The customer wanted an efficient way to store their memories. Go back to the drill bit. So that's the most important thing of the whole lot. Kodak then starts to realize that actually maybe we better look into this because it's starting to evolve. So what do? They conduct research, and they spend a lot of money looking into it to work out, is this digital thing actually going to happen? It actually reminds me, in the mid-1970s, I was fairly young, and television came to South Africa. And of course, as all kids did, we begged my parents to get a TV. And my father said he's actually not buying into that fad because it's not going to last. All right, so that's the background that I come from, but never mind. Okay, so Kodak conduct this research, and what do they find? There's good news and there's bad news. They found that the good news was, no, the bad news first, because I think let's do that. The bad news was this digital wave is going to happen. No matter what they do about it, there's going to be a digital revolution in the film industry. What's the good news? It's going to take 10 years for this to happen. That was the opportunity. They had 10 years. They were aware of it. It was their own research. But what did they do? Nothing. Nothing. So Kodak lost their way, and that was the end of it. Why? Because they were fixated on what their business was, not what their customer's business was. So what was this? This, to me, was a tremendous fear, not of the customer, not on the customer side, but on the company side. It was a fear of innovation. They couldn't deal with it. And I wanted to bring an example of a company that did innovate. And I found this company particularly fascinating. And that is a company called SodaStream. And I think do you all know of SodaStream? So I didn't realize that they actually were started in 1903. They were British. And they go through all of these iterations. And again, back to the 1970s, I was mortified because we did have a SodaStream at home, but there was nothing more embarrassing than having friends over and have your father bring out a SodaStream. Where all your friends, they would want the real stuff. But anyway, it was very uncool in the 70s and 80s, that's for sure. But it goes through this whole metamorphosis in the 1990s. It gets sold, and in the earlier part of this century, what happens is they start to see that there's something else developing in the carbonated industry. And what is that? If you just look at the colors, it gives it away. They suddenly started to see that people were looking at sustainability, they were looking at green, they were looking at healthier drinks, way ahead of the mainstream guys, way ahead of Coca-Cola, who is tremendously behind in this industry. And what do? They position themselves with reusable products, very, very green friendly. I just read an article 2 weeks ago that they've got this whole massive campaign to help clean up the oceans. They've identified what the world is demanding. The world is demanding sustainability, environmental, no carbon footprint. It's demanding a bit of health. We don't want all the sugar in it. They realized this earlier on at the turn of the century. And as a result of it, they've just sold it in August of this year. They sold SodaStream to PepsiCo for $3.2 billion. Why? Because they looked at what their customer wanted, not the product that they were selling. Okay. So now we've got a bit of, we've got some kind of an idea as to what my theme is. But here's something that I've noticed on the show, on my radio show actually. One of the things I like to do, it's not right, but I do it, it's just is what I do, is I like to irritate my listeners just a little bit. So if I find something that irritates them and annoys them a little bit, I kind of go with that. Now, this happened completely by mistake. I do happen to think in South Africa that we've got spring set at the wrong date. Because if you look around August, the trees are blooming, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. Yeah, you can have a cold snap, but isn't that what spring is meant to be? It's not summer, it's hot, it's cold, it's spring. So anyway, I like to tell my listeners from about August that we are celebrating the most beautiful spring. What I didn't realize was going to happen is that I would get the most horrendous messages from my listeners. Angry, livid, fuming with me that I am bringing in spring early. It's not spring. Spring is the 1st of September, they tell me. How would you know better? You know that it is the 1st of September. Why are you insisting? And then if it was cold, God forbid, one morning I'd get messages with screenshots of how cold it is, in case I didn't know, because I don't know why I wouldn't know, but I knew. So I found that always interesting, and I wrote an article for News 24 because this perplexed me. And I called the article, Why Do We Hate Spring? And I think we don't hate spring, we love spring. But I think that we are very nervous to acknowledge that it's spring in case we're disappointed. Because it's much easier to be in winter. It is much easier because then we're not disappointed. We know it's cold. We know we're going to be miserable. We're okay with that. We're not stepping out of our comfort zone to allow ourselves to maybe be disappointed. So then I thought, let's take this a little bit further. And I've got a friend who runs she's CEO of a company called Acumen Media. And what she does is they monitor social media. And every week I chat to her, and we look at the big stories of what's happening in the week. How much are we talking? What are South Africans talking about? You can listen to my show on Friday as well. Like we do this. It's very predictable in terms of South Africa, sadly. But what I wanted to know from her is there a difference between how we talk about good news stories and how we talk about bad news stories? And the first thing she said to me is, you've got to know that all social media, we have attention deficit. We just keep forgetting our stories. We move on very, very quickly. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing to note. But what is interesting to note is that good news stories last a lot shorter than bad news stories. We talk about bad news for much longer than we talk about good news stories. And I find that quite sad and quite interesting, but fascinating nevertheless, because we do tend to hold on to that negative stuff. We don't really want it to be spring. And I wonder what that is about, why that is that we kind of hold on to that negativity for longer, why we hold on to winter for longer. And I recognize, I know that the 1st of September is spring. I'm not saying that people should adjust their calendars according to my idiosyncrasy, but it's just interesting to note how we fight, and I find that people around fight these issues. So then I went back, and I thought this is an interesting way to look at it as well. And I believe that Barack Obama also speaks about this from time to time. Do we all know the story of Icarus? Yes? No? Okay. So I think most of us do. What happens is Icarus and his father are stranded. It's Greek mythology. Icarus and his father are stranded on an island of Crete, and they have no way to get off. So his father decides that the best way to do this is to create wings out of feathers and wax. And then you're going to fly, and basically they'll catch the wind and they will fly. What does Icarus's father warn him not to do? Shout out. Fly too close to the sun. Is there any other thing he told him not to do? Exactly. And we don't talk about that. Icarus's father told him, don't fly too high because the sun will melt the wax and your wings will fall apart. But the original story also tells Icarus not to fly too low, because then he will catch the moisture of the waves and the sea, and the feathers will get heavy and he will fall into the ocean. Now that part of the story has disappeared. And they traced back to where it disappeared, and it was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, that part of the warning goes. Why? Because it was worthwhile to keep workers, to keep factory workers. There was no need to warn them about going too low. It didn't matter. We didn't want them to go too high. If they went too low, it didn't matter at all. So we've kind of dropped that, which is fascinating. The other thing is I found an article in it was one of the engineering magazines, which I just saying I don't read very often because I don't understand anything. But what they did was they worked out, in fact, how it would work if they could they construct wings as Icarus did. And turns out they can, and I think it was 6 meters. I can't remember exactly how big it was. But they worked out that after about 45 minutes, given the time of year, given the latitude of where Crete is, he was going, no matter how really where he was within a certain range, the sun was going to melt that wax anyway, and he was going to plummet to his death. Unless he did one thing, and we all seem to forget about that. When we're in an aeroplane and we're flying at 33,000 feet, and you look at that screen in front of you, you're quite a bit closer to the sun than you were on the ground, but yet it's freezing cold. So actually the only way for Icarus to have survived it was to have gone higher. So here's a great example of us being told over and over again. Now, the point of the story with Icarus's father in the Greek mythology was not that. Their story was basically stay in the middle. Don't go too low, don't go too high, because you don't want to be arrogant, you don't want to be too humble, you want to stay exactly in the middle. We've dropped that and we say don't go too high. But the reality is the only way in which to survive that is to go much, much higher. So here we have all of these different aspects. And what we're starting to see is that there's a focus on the type of business that we do. There's a focus on what we've been taught. But when we're making decisions in business, we also have to look at our own experience. Because the whole point of, I think, in making decisions is to look at ourselves and to look at the experience that we've had. So I found an amazing, amazing study, and I didn't do it myself, so please don't tell Peter. But they did an experiment. A guy by the name of Martin Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology, he did an experiment with dogs, and it was called learned helplessness. He came up with this theory that said our negativity is learned. So let me tell you the example the test that they did, and it doesn't sound nice, but the research that I've done on this says that the shocks that these dogs got, it was just like a little uncomfortable shock. No dog's hair was curled because of those shocks. So what happened is he took a bunch of dogs, he split them in two, he separated them, the control study, and one of them, the one group, he put in an area, and they tie these little electrodes to their paws, and they would blow a whistle, the very Pavlovian kind of a thing, so they would associate the whistle with what was going to happen next, and they'd give them a little shock. The one group could stop the shock by bashing their noses against like a little panel, right? So let's describe that again. You've got dogs with little paws, little electrodes to their paws. Whistle goes, electric shock happens, and the dogs find very quickly that if they bash this little panel with their nose, they can stop it, okay? Put those dogs aside. Group number 2, they tie their little electrodes there, and they blow the whistle. They give the shock, but there's nothing that those dogs can do to stop that little electric current. And after a few minutes, it just stops on its own, and that's the end of the experiment. They then take both groups of dogs, and they put them in like an enclosure with a small wall between, or a little fence between. What they do is they electrify the floor. So the minute that they blow the whistle, what they're going to do is electrify that floor. So they blow the whistle, they electrify the floor. What happens? Some of the dogs jump over this little wall to get away, and some don't. Some just lie there and wait for it to finish. Who do you think did what? Obviously, the dogs that were taught they could hit the panel and stop the electric shock were the ones to jump over the wall, because they had been taught that there was something that they could do to stop what was happening to them. The others just lay there. It's the saddest experiment. They just lay there until the shock finished. And he calls that learned helplessness. Now think about that in terms of our own environment. If you're an entrepreneur and you invest in a business and it's a horrible experience and you've lost money, what we learn is to be very, very cautious the next time. How do kids who climb up trees become adults who are very firmly rooted to the ground, if you'll excuse that pun? But it's very interesting because we learn the stuff. We learn that certain things are going to have a negative result. So what he concluded was that helplessness or pessimism is learned, but that also means, of course, that we can teach ourselves optimism. We can look at things in a different way if we're aware of it. If we're going into a situation and we're trying to make a decision, we can see if something is because of our own background and our own stuff, or if it is, and I'm going to teach you different tools. So now here's an interesting one. I told you in the beginning, one of the things I wanted to also discuss is man flu. All right, so now I happen to be a very, very serious sufferer of man flu. I get it at least once every year, sometimes twice. My wife doesn't recognize how serious it is. Each year, I feel it's getting worse and worse. I hover literally on the brink of death for a few days, but okay, my marital stuff is not your business. But the reality is, as terrible as I feel, and as convinced as I think I might be that I am hovering between life and death for just those few hours or days, I also know that I'm going to get better. If we think about how terrible we feel, and now jokes aside, how terrible we feel when we've got flu and we can barely breathe and our chest is congested, we should be in a proper panic. We really should be. Okay, I am, but I'm maybe a bit different. But the reality is that we're not. And we're not because from this age, most years we get a cold. And sometimes we get it better, sometimes it's worse, but every time we get better. So what are we taught, and what is the message in all of that for us, is when you have a cold, relax. It's horrible, but you're going to get better. So that is, to some extent, what learned optimism is. Because even though, okay, we say this time it's going to be different, and that we know that we were close to death, we know really that we are going to get better. And that's an interesting lesson. And we've got to look at that stuff in relation to how we behave in any other environment. Right, so I want to talk to you now, because how do we do that? So now we've got all of these great ideas. We know that our pessimism is learned, our helplessness is learned. We know that sometimes we look at our own business and our own stuff and not that of our customer because it's easier and because it's just simpler to do that. How do we actually take the steps to get over this? So, does anybody know what Stoicism is? Okay, so Stoicism, again, back to the Greeks. It's a very bad, Stoicism has got a bad name today because we like to talk about our feelings all the time, and we sometimes say, oh, he's so stoic or she's so stoic, because some people don't talk about their feelings. It isn't that. What Stoicism is it's a philosophy that teaches us to separate emotion and thought. So we can recognize that there's emotion, but try and find ways to work through and understand what is an emotion that is causing us to make that decision, and what is something that is actually a real a real concern. So along comes a guy, and if you haven't watched any of his videos or his YouTube videos, it's probably worth doing. His name is Tim Ferriss, and he's done a lot of work on this, and I found him quite interesting because he's a guy who he suffers from depression. Very, very successful in high school. He was really one of those people that did very, very well, and he found himself in really terrible positions, and he realized that he was unable to separate his emotion from and his fears from reality. So he actually comes up with a very, very nice way of looking at it. And just bear with me for a minute. This is how he does it. He gives an example, and he says he's been working very, very hard. He's about to burn out. He lives in America. He's 24 hours a day he's working. His relationship with his girlfriend has crumbled or is crumbling, and he needs a break. A friend calls him and says, come to me in London. You will have a great time. Come and he says, no, I can't. I just can't. So why can't he? He says, because, the first thing is I'm a depressive. I suffer from bipolar depression, and I'm worried that the miserable weather in London is going to affect me. The friend says, why else? And he says, because, I don't know, I'm petrified I'm going to get a letter from, the IRS, and I'm not going to, it's pure anxiety. I'm not going to be able to answer it, then I'm going to get audited, and he goes this whole journey. So then what he does is say, okay, you know what, let's break this down. The first thing we want to look at is there a way to prevent this from happening? So I've got my fear, I've got two fears. Is there a way to prevent it from happening? So let's look at the light story, the London weather. A way to prevent it is maybe to travel with one of those blue lights, or there's apparently a light that you can travel with. So that's one way to prevent that, and you can use it in the apartment. And the second thing is the IRS. He can give his accountant's details as a forwarding address, and that could prevent that happening. But let's take it further. What happens if it does happen? Well, if it happens, and he does get depressed, even with this light, then maybe he can get on a plane and go to Spain for a few days. It's not that far. Yes, it'll cost him a few quid, but it's a way to resolve that. If he does get audited, well, he's got a friend who's a professor of law. Other people have been audited in the past. He hasn't done anything wrong. He will work through that. So what he's done with this is he's imagined the worst. We often tell people, stop stressing about that, stop being anxious about that. It's probably never going to happen. And I can tell you that nobody gets reassured by that. Nobody says, you know what, you're quite right, or they might say you're quite right, but they don't believe you. Because when they go back to their room or they go back to their desk, they're still stressing about the same thing. So I like to think that people should imagine the worst. But first, now that you've imagined it, if you name it, you can tame it. So say what it is, then find a way to prevent it. And if you can't prevent it, find a way, a solution to solve it. Once you've done that, then you're much better equipped now to make the decision. Then you could say, what is the cost of inaction? What is the cost of Tim Ferriss's inaction if he doesn't go to London? Chances are he's going to burn out from his business perspective, and he'll probably lose a lot there. And what's happened, and his relationship is going to fail completely. So there is a cost to inaction. And I think that we have to note how big a deal inaction is. Inaction is costly. So then only once you've done that, are we equipped to say, what are the positive possible outcomes of my trip to London? I'll feel restored, maybe I'll meet good people there, and then I can move forward. So he goes through this whole process of saying, let's separate what my fear is from rational thought. And I can tell you that in my own business, and I've been involved, I'm a lawyer by qualification. I ran a commodity trading company for many, many years. For 15 years, we built this up. And I can tell you that it got to a point about 5 years ago that I was working so hard, and that I was so consumed by this business, and it was a very difficult trading environment. 2008 had happened, commodity prices came down, then they came back up. China was the only show in town, so they were pushing on pricing. It was a mad, mad time. And instead of saying, hold on, what do we need to do to change our environment? We didn't. We held on we held on tight, we weathered that storm, and at the end of it, I had 2 robberies, not related to the business, but I was followed from my office, and what happened is they broke me. Because I hadn't allowed any form of give, any form of compromise to be able to say, hold on, let me just take a step back just a little bit, breathe a little bit. Maybe we don't need that amount of staff. Maybe consolidate. Maybe we didn't need to be the king of Chrome, which is what we were, and everything would be, we would actually still survive that. And instead what happened was, because I was so rigid, and because I became so obsessed with who we were, and not what our customers needed, and not what the industry was about, that I didn't recognize it. And it took 2 robberies to shatter that shell of mine to be able to say, you know what, we could have done something completely different in this business. And that's a lot of my message to people based on my own experience, is to try and find a way to move a little bit and to be able to look at an environment from a situation, from all angles, so that it doesn't need to get to that you Kodak, and that it's so difficult to look outside of your business and rather to make the mistake, certainly, that we did. So what do the following have in common? Now you can look at it, and I hope it'll make a lot more sense. Man flu, we survive it. A lost watch, well, we've got to look where it's dark and not only where it's light. Spring is exciting. We shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge that sometimes, we can put ourselves out there. Electrically shocked dogs, Kodak, the spice trade, and most importantly is that 1/4-inch drill bit. These all link together, certainly for my story, to be able to create something, to create a narrative. Takeaway points: fear of innovation is seldom about innovation. It's fear. It's the wrong focus of our business. Sometimes we do feel safer in negativity. We do learn helplessness, which means we can unlearn helplessness. I think there is a way to say, let's look at the worst thing that can happen. Don't disallow yourself from looking at the worst case scenario. Don't stop that narrative. Have that narrative. Imagine the worst. Then find a way to prevent it. And if you can't prevent it, then you find a way to fix it. And don't forget to look at the cost, the opportunity cost of not doing something, because that's as important as the fear of doing something. And I guess what's also important to remember is spring is wonderful, but it can be chilly. And we don't need to be so nervous about that. It can be chilly in spring. And I think that to me, the most important lesson of the lot is to keep asking, when a customer asks you for a 1/4-inch drill bit, what is it that they are really looking for? Thank you, everybody.